February 13, 1945. 10:03 p.m. Dresden, Germany. The porcelain teacups still held warmth. In the parlors of the Altstadt, families gathered around tables where Meissen china, delicate, hand-painted, centuries old, caught the amber glow of oil lamps. Outside, the Elbe River moved silent and black beneath a moonless sky. The baroque spires of the Frauenkirche rose against the darkness like frozen prayers, their sandstone facades untouched by war. For 4 years, Dresden had remained a sanctuary, a city of culture and beauty suspended in amber, while the Reich crumbled at its edges. The air smelled of February cold, of coal smoke from chimneys, of bread baking in ovens that had known no shortage. Children slept in beds their grandparents had slept in. In the conservatory, a violin student practiced Brahms, the notes drifting through narrow medieval streets where no rubble lay, where no craters interrupted the cobblestones. Then, at 10:03, the air raid sirens began to scream. The sound was unfamiliar to most. Dresden had heard sirens before 159 times in the war's duration, but they had always been false alarms, precautionary wails that sent citizens to cellars for tea and nervous laughter before the all-clear sent them back to their lives. The city had no strategic industries of consequence, no tank factories or munitions plants that marked other German cities for destruction. It was a city of art schools and music halls, of the Zwinger Palace and the Semperoper, where Wagner and Strauss had premiered their works. Refugees from the Eastern Front, families fleeing the advancing Red Army, had swelled the population to nearly 1 million, believing Dresden's cultural heritage would shield them from mathematics of strategic bombing. They believed, as humans believe against evidence, that beauty might be a form of armor. The first British Mosquito Pathfinders appeared at 10:13 p.m., their engines a distant hum that grew to thunder. From cellars and doorways, civilians watched red flares bloom against the night, target indicators dropping in slow, graceful arcs, painting the historic center with light. The flares were beautiful, almost festive, like fireworks at a summer festival. Then came the first wave, 244 Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force, their bomb bays loaded with high explosives and incendiaries in carefully calculated ratios. The bombardiers had studied maps where Dresden's medieval core, its tightly packed timber frame buildings, its narrow streets designed for horse carts, its absence of modern fire breaks, appeared as a theorem in combustion physics. The first bombs fell at 10:14. High explosives struck first, their detonations ripping roofs from buildings, blowing out windows, stripping tiles, and exposing the wooden bones of structures that had stood for 500 years. The blast waves killed by pressure, collapsing lungs, rupturing organs, but that was merely preparation. What followed were the incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of 4-pound magnesium devices tumbling from the sky like burning rain. They punched through weakened roofs and ignited attics. They shattered on cobblestones and ignited doorways. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires bloomed across the Altstadt, each one finding timber dry from winter heating, each one feeding on furniture and books and the accumulated possessions of generations. From the cellars, families heard the world above them transform into sound, the crump of explosives, the crack of collapsing masonry, and then a new noise, a roaring, feeding sound like something alive and hungry. The fires were beginning to merge, to speak to each other through heat and updraft, to form something that had no name in German civilian experience. The temperature in the cellars began to rise. Smoke seeped through floorboards and ventilation shafts, thick and black, carrying the smell of burning paint and varnish, and wood that had been part of homes and churches and museums. The children cried. The mothers wrapped them in wet blankets and tried to sing lullabies over the roar. At 1:30 a.m., after 3 hours of respite that allowed survivors to emerge into streets now unrecognizable, the second wave arrived. This was doctrine, a technique refined through years of bombing German cities. Strike first to break and expose, then return when rescue workers and survivors have emerged. This second wave comprised 529 Lancaster bombers, their payload focused on expanding the fire zone outward, preventing containment, ensuring that what had begun as hundreds of separate fires would complete its transformation into a single phenomenon. The German language had no adequate word for it. Later, borrowed from English, they would call it Feuersturm. Firestorm. The physics were elegant and terrible. Hundreds of individual fires create hundreds of individual updrafts. These updrafts, seeking oxygen, pull fresh air horizontally toward the fire zone from all directions. As the fires merge and intensify, the updrafts combine into a single massive column of superheated air rising thousands of feet. The inward rushing replacement air accelerates, becomes wind, then hurricane, then something beyond hurricane, winds of 150 miles per hour, feeding oxygen to flames burning at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The firestorm becomes self-sustaining, a thermal engine that creates its own weather, its own physics. Trees were uprooted and sucked into the flames. People attempting to flee found themselves pulled backward into the inferno by winds impossible to resist. Those who fell could not rise. The hurricane dragged them across cobblestones toward ovens that had once been buildings. Maria Rosenberg, age 43, a librarian at the Saxon State Library, had taken shelter in the cellar beneath her apartment building on Pragerstrasse with her mother and 17 other neighbors. They survived the first wave, though the building above them burned. During the interim, Maria's mother insisted they leave, that the cellar would become a tomb. Maria refused. She had read about Hamburg, about the firestorm there in 1943. She knew that outside meant exposure to the second wave. They argued while above them the city transformed into a landscape from Dante. Buildings collapsed into their own foundations. Streets became rivers of melted asphalt. The stone saints on church facades cracked and fell like judgment made literal. When the second wave began, the decision was made for them. The temperature in the cellar rose past bearable. The oxygen grew thin. People began to suffocate, not from smoke, but from the fire above consuming all available air. Maria and 6 others broke for the street. They wrapped themselves in wet blankets and ran through a world that had ceased to obey natural law. The wind drove embers horizontally like burning bullets. The heat was a physical force, a pressure that made breathing agony. Years later, Maria would testify that she saw people, living people, suddenly burst into flame, their clothing igniting spontaneously from radiant heat before they'd touched any fire. She saw a mother carrying 2 children collapse as the winds exceeded her strength, saw all 3 drag backward into a burning building, as if the fire itself had hands. She witnessed a streetcar, abandoned and burning, with people inside who had sought shelter there, now silhouettes behind windows, opaque with heat. The air itself was fire. To breathe was to burn from within. She survived by finding a water reservoir, a static water tank installed for firefighting, and submerging herself to her nose, staying there for 4 hours while the firestorm raged around her, while the temperature of the water itself approached boiling. When dawn came, she emerged into a city that no longer existed. They had believed themselves exempt. That belief was Germany's particular delusion in the winter of 1945, that cultural heritage, architectural magnificence, the weight of centuries might somehow exempt them from the logic of total war. Dresden was the Florence on the Elbe, a city that had contributed Böttcher's porcelain and Semper's opera house to human civilization. It contained the Sistine Madonna, Raphael's masterpiece, housed in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Alte Meister. Its museums held treasures that belonged not to Germany alone, but to the accumulated inheritance of Western culture. Surely the civilians believed, surely Churchill and Roosevelt and their bomber commanders recognized this. Surely they would spare what deserved sparing. But the British and Americans had refined a different calculus. They had watched Warsaw and Rotterdam burn under Luftwaffe incendiaries. They had counted London's dead during the Blitz, catalogued the civilians killed in Coventry when German bombers targeted the medieval city center. They had studied Hamburg's firestorm in July 1943, 40,000 dead in a single night, and noted with professional interest the conditions required: density of construction, timber frame buildings, meteorological factors, the proper ratio of high explosive to incendiary. Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, called strategic bombing dehousing, a bureaucratic euphemism that acknowledged the true targets were not factories but the workers who staffed them, not infrastructure but the civilian population whose morale and capacity to sustain industrial warfare would be systematically destroyed. By February 1945, the Allied combined bomber offensive had evolved into something approaching industrial process. The American 8th Air Force bombed by day, with precision doctrine, their B-17s and B-24s targeting specific industrial facilities with Norden bomb sights calibrated to release ordnance from 25,000 feet. The British bombed by night, their Lancasters dropping area incendiaries designed to create maximum civilian casualties and urban destruction. Together, they implemented round-the-clock pressure, Americans destroying factories during daylight, British erasing the cities that surrounded them after dark. Germany was being disassembled piece by piece, burned away systematically, reduced from industrial power to medieval landscape of rubble and ash. Dresden's turn came as part of Operation Thunderclap, a coordinated series of maximum-effort raids against Eastern German cities. The strategic justification was sound within the logic of total war. Dresden was a communications hub where 7 railway lines converged. Through Dresden flowed German reinforcements attempting to stabilize the Eastern Front against Soviet advances. The city contained marshalling yards, a Zeiss-Icon optical factory, an arsenal. These were legitimate military targets by any definition of strategic bombing. But the target zones selected for the night raids, the baroque Altstadt, far from the industrial suburbs, suggested objectives beyond military necessity. The raid was calculated to kill civilians, to terrorize, to demonstrate to both the German population and the advancing Soviet forces the reach and terrible efficiency of Allied air power. When dawn broke on February 14th, Dresden no longer possessed a historic center. The Altstadt had been deleted, transformed into a smoking crater 13 square kilometers in extent. The Frauenkirche, Dresden's iconic Protestant church with its stone dome that had dominated the skyline for 2 centuries, stood initially, its massive sandstone construction having survived the direct impacts. But the heat, sustained temperatures above 1,500 degrees for hours, had transformed the stone's crystalline structure. At 10 a.m. on February 15th, 36 hours after the first bombs fell, the dome collapsed, the weakened stone finally surrendering to gravity, burying the refugees who had sheltered inside beneath thousands of tons of rubble. The Zwinger Palace, that masterpiece of Baroque architecture with its pavilions and galleries, its orange trees and fountains, destroyed. The Semperoper, where Wagner had premiered Rienzi and the Flying Dutchman, a gutted shell. The Residenzschloss, which had housed Saxon electors for 4 centuries, erased. The Kreuzkirche, the Sophiankirche, the Great Garden, all gone or damaged beyond recognition. Street after street of timber frame houses, of merchants' homes and artisans' workshops, structures that had survived the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars and 4 years of World War II, reduced to ash and brick fragments. The city's extensive collection of priceless art had been evacuated to surrounding castles and mines, a contingency that proved Dresden's authorities had understood the risk even as its civilians denied it. But the architecture, the urban fabric itself, the accumulated physical heritage of centuries, that could not be evacuated. The casualties defied precise counting for reasons both practical and political. The Nazi propaganda ministry, in its final weeks of existence, claimed 200,000 dead, a figure inflated for political purposes, to demonstrate Allied barbarity, to perhaps shame the British and Americans into moderating their bombing campaign. Post-war investigations, hampered by chaos and displaced populations, estimated 25,000 dead. Modern scholarship, after reunification allowed access to East German archives, places the figure between 22,000 and 25,000, a number horrific in its scale, yet smaller than the 40,000 who died in Hamburg, smaller than the hundreds of thousands who would die in Tokyo's firestorm the following month. The exact number matters less than the fact that the vast majority were civilians, women, children, elderly, refugees who had fled east believing they fled towards safety. Among the dead was Kathy Kollwitz's grandson, Peter, age 20, killed in the raids. Kollwitz, Germany's greatest visual artist, sculptor of mothers and dead children, chronicler of grief and war's human cost, did not live to learn of his death. She died herself 3 weeks later. But her work, her endless variations on the Pieta theme, on mothers holding dead sons, became Dresden's inadvertent memorial. Victor Klemper, the Jewish philologist who had survived in Dresden through the protection of his Aryan wife, described February 14th as the day that saved his life. The chaos allowed him to tear off his yellow star and disappear into the refugee streams to survive the war's final months by becoming one of thousands of displaced persons. The fires that killed tens of thousands granted him anonymity, the cover of chaos that rigid Nazi bureaucracy could no longer penetrate. The American bombing on February 14th and 15th, daylight raids by the 8th Air Force, extended the destruction outward. B-17s dropped 771 tons of bombs on Dresden's marshalling yards and industrial suburbs, completing what the British night raids had begun. American crews, flying through smoke columns visible from 100 miles away, reported they could not see the city beneath them. Only brown smoke shot through with red, a cloud that reached above their bombing altitude of 25,000 feet. The bombardiers released on radar returns and pathfinder indicators, dropping ordnance into smoke so thick it had become solid on radar screens. What they hit, whether rail yards or residential districts or rubble that was already rubble, became academic. Dresden was burning with such intensity that precision targeting became impossible. The city had been transformed from target into phenomenon, from place into process, from noun into verb. From the ruins, survivors emerged into a landscape that resembled photographs they would see later of Hiroshima. Buildings had been reduced to ground level, their rubble compressed and fused by heat into solid masses. Bodies were everywhere, burned beyond identification, huddled in cellars where they'd suffocated, flash-burned in streets where radiant heat had killed before flames arrived. The Altmarkt, Dresden's historic marketplace, became a cremation ground where thousands of bodies were stacked and burned on pyres fueled by diesel oil because no other method could process that quantity of dead, because disease threatened the living, because the February cold had begun to preserve corpses in ways that invited typhus and cholera. The pyres burned for weeks, tended by SS units and prisoners, and eventually Soviet soldiers as the Red Army arrived in early May. The smell, a combination of burning flesh and diesel fuel, became inseparable from Dresden's liberation, a scent that survivors would smell for the rest of their lives in unexpected moments, triggered by a kitchen fire or a traffic accident, or sometimes nothing at all. The German civilians who witnessed Dresden's destruction struggled to reconcile what they had experienced with what they had believed about the war, about their role in it, about justice and civilization. They had been told for years that Germany fought for culture against Bolshevik barbarism, that the Wehrmacht defended European civilization against Eastern savagery. Yet here from the West, from Britain and America, from democracies that claimed moral superiority, from nations that spoke of liberation and freedom, came annihilation more thorough than anything they had feared from Stalin's armies. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could the nations of Churchill and Roosevelt, of Shakespeare and Jefferson, unleash this? How could the military forces of democracies commit what appeared to be pure vengeance disguised as strategy? They did not ask, or could not allow themselves to ask, what German bombers had done to Warsaw, to Rotterdam, to Coventry, to London's East End. They did not calculate what German artillery had done to Stalingrad or German occupation policies had done to Ukraine. They did not visit the camps. Buchenwald lay only 150 kilometers west, their Scienstadt 60 kilometers south, where Germany's victims counted their dead in industrial numbers that dwarfed even Dresden's horror. The German civilians at Dresden understood themselves as victims of something that violated the laws of civilized warfare, that exceeded military necessity, that punished women and children for the crimes of their government. They were not wrong in this understanding, but was incomplete. They were victims of a style of warfare that Germany itself had pioneered, had practiced enthusiastically from Warsaw to Stalingrad, and now found visited upon them with Anglo-American efficiency and overwhelming material superiority. The symbolism was inescapable and intentional. Where the Luftwaffe had dropped tens of tons of bombs, the RAF dropped thousands. Where German industry struggled by 1945 to produce fighters to defend German airspace, American factories delivered bombers by the thousands, their production lines so efficient that losses, even heavy losses, were merely statistics absorbed by replacement aircraft and crews. Dresden's destruction demonstrated not merely air power, but economic power, the capacity of democratic industrial economies to outproduce authoritarian rivals so completely that the sky itself became a weapon platform impossible to contest. By February 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively extinct. The German civilians at Dresden looked up and saw not Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but Lancasters and B-17s, hundreds at a time, flying in formation at altitudes German flak could barely reach, untroubled by fighter interception, delivering ordnance with the mechanical regularity of factory production, which is precisely what strategic bombing had become. The recurring symbol in survivor testimonies is the teacup, specifically Meissen porcelain teacups found intact in the rubble. Meissen china, manufactured in Dresden suburbs since 1710, represented European craftsmanship at its finest, porcelain so fine it was translucent when held to light, hand-painted with scenes of pastoral beauty or oriental fantasy. These cups, designed to hold warmth and be held delicately, to accompany conversation and civilization, emerged from apocalyptic fires unbroken. They were found in cellars where their owners had suffocated, in shops whose walls had vaporized, in apartments reduced to ash. The cups survived because porcelain, fired at 1,400 degrees Celsius in its creation, could endure the firestorm's heat. They survived as mockery, delicate things outlasting the robust, beauty persisting while the people who valued beauty died. Survivors carried these cups when they fled Dresden, packed them in refugee bundles as they walked west away from the Soviet advance. The cups became relics, physical proof that Dresden had existed, that a city of culture and beauty had stood on the Elbe before fire consumed it. Decades later, in the Federal Republic, in apartments and houses where Dresden refugees had settled, these cups remained, kept in cabinets, used only on special occasions, handed to grandchildren with stories of a lost city that sounded increasingly mythical as post-war reconstruction proceeded, and the generation that remembered died. The cups were evidence, artifacts that testified, we were civilized, we valued beauty, and civilization did not save us. The transformation of consciousness that Dresden produced in German civilians was subtle and profound. It completed a process begun at Hamburg, continued at Cologne and Berlin, refined at Pforzheim and Würzburg. The German people learned that total war, when turned against its originators, was not glorious or heroic, but simply total. They learned that cultural heritage provided no exemption, that beauty was not armor, that their cities could burn as thoroughly as any they had burned. They learned, though few articulated it consciously, that the laws of war they had accepted when Germany was winning, when the Wehrmacht drove across Poland and France, when the Luftwaffe bombed cities from London to Belgrade, applied with equal validity when Germany was losing. Reciprocity, it turned out, was the only law of total war that both sides honored completely. The larger truth Dresden illuminates concerns the nature of total war, and the illusions civilians maintain until illusion becomes impossible. The German civilians at Dresden in early 1945 believed themselves fundamentally different from military targets, believed that their cultural heritage and civilian status provided meaningful protection. They were confronting the same illusion that Polish civilians confronted in 1939, that British civilians confronted in 1940, that Soviet civilians confronted in 1941. Total war recognizes no meaningful distinction between military and civilian when civilian populations sustain military effort through industrial labor, agricultural production, logistical support. Strategic bombing doctrine, developed by theorists and implemented by commanders who watched city after city burn, treated urban populations as targetable not from cruelty but from a cold calculus. Destroying cities destroyed the capacity and will to continue fighting. This calculus was not unique to democracies or dictatorships, to Axis or allies. It was logic that emerged from industrial warfare's nature, from the fact that modern war required entire societies mobilized for military production. When factories depended on workers who required housing and transportation and food distribution networks, then housing and transportation and food distribution became legitimate targets in a logic that extended military necessity to encompass civilian infrastructure. The Hague Conventions and Geneva Protocols attempted to preserve distinctions between combatants and civilians, but those distinctions eroded under the pressures of total war, where societies mobilized comprehensively and military commanders sought any advantage that would hasten victory and reduce their own casualties. Dresden's burning revealed that democracies, when fighting for survival against existential threats, would employ methods as ruthless as any dictatorship. The British and American crews who bombed Dresden were not criminals. They were servicemen following orders, implementing doctrine, executing mission plans developed by command staffs who believed strategic bombing would shorten the war and ultimately save lives by compelling German surrender. Whether that belief was accurate remained debated by historians and strategists for decades afterward. But the sincerity of the belief that bombing German cities served valid military purposes was genuine. The crews who flew those missions understood themselves as soldiers fighting justified war against Nazi Germany. The civilians who burned beneath their bombs were not targeted from hatred but from strategic calculation that defined enemy populations as war-sustaining resources. This creates moral complexity that defies simple judgment. Dresden's destruction was simultaneously a tragedy and a consequence, a violation of civilian immunity, and a strategic operation, excessive and calculated. It existed in the terrible gray zone where military necessity met moral cost, where legitimate strategic objectives were pursued through methods that killed thousands of civilians, where defenders of liberal democracy implemented doctrines of total war that erased distinctions democracy theoretically honored. There is no resolving this complexity, no equation that balances inputs to produce clear moral outputs. Dresden remains uncomfortable for precisely this reason. It resists clean categorization as either clearly justified or clearly criminal. The firestorm that consumed Dresden's Baroque heart on February 13th to 14th, 1945 burned away more than buildings and lives. It burned away illusions about warfare's limits, about culture's protective value, about the boundaries of what civilized nations would do to each other. The teacups that survived, delicate and translucent, testify to a world where beauty and craftsmanship mattered, where porcelain hand-painted with pastoral scenes represented values worth preserving. That those cups outlasted the civilization that created them serves as the cruelest irony. That things prove more durable than the people who valued them. That artifacts survive the culture that gave them meaning. In the end, Dresden reveals a truth about total war that applies across ideologies and across time. That when nations commit completely to warfare, when survival itself appears at stake, then all restraints become negotiable, all limitations temporary, all moral boundaries subject to revision. The German civilians who watched their city burn learned what total war means when applied against them. They learned it from democracies they had been taught were weak, from industrial economies they had been told were decadent, from air forces so vast and efficient that defense became impossible. The lesson was written in fire across 13 square kilometers of Baroque architecture, delivered by thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries, taught by men who flew home to bases in England and would fly again the next night to burn another city. The Elbe still flows past Dresden, indifferent to human history, moving east toward the sea as it moved before the firestorm and after. The teacups, those that survived, sit in cabinets and museums, hold coffee or tea, or sometimes flowers, remain functional and beautiful and scarred. The rebuilt Frauenkirche stands again, its blackened original stones visible among new sandstone, a building simultaneously restored and ruined, present and memory. February 13th comes annually, and Dresden remembers, though what exactly it remembers, and how that memory instructs present understanding, remains contested. Some see tragedy without context. Others see consequence embedded in causation. Most see both, holding complexity without resolution, understanding that Dresden's burning was simultaneously terrible and explicable, unjustifiable, and inevitable once total war's logic was accepted by all combatants. The truth Dresden teaches is uncomfortable for everyone. It troubles those who defend strategic bombing by revealing its costs in children's bodies and architectural treasures. It troubles those who condemn strategic bombing by demanding they confront what German bombers did first and what halting the Nazi regime required. It troubles simple narratives of good wars fought cleanly by forces that recognize moral limits. Dresden insists instead that total war corrupts all participants, that democracies at war abandon peacetime morality, that the difference between civilization and barbarism becomes academic when cities burn and civilians die by tens of thousands. The firestorm consumed more than Dresden's Baroque center. It consumed illusions about war's nature, about what civilized nations would do when civilization itself appeared threatened. And the teacups remain delicate, translucent, holding light when held to windows, surviving what their owners could not, testifying that beauty once mattered in a city on the Elbe, where families gathered in parlors and children practiced Brahms, and the future appeared to honor the past. Before the sirens, before the bombers, before the fire that answered fire with fire so vast that the Elbe itself reflected red, that smoke rose visible from 100 miles, that the temperature at ground level exceeded what stone and flesh could endure. The cups testify to a world before. What came after they hold in silence, beautiful and empty and impossibly fragile.